The World Affairs Council of Greater Reading is the leading educational organization promoting understanding and enlightenment on global issues. Welcome back once again. I am Mike. I'll be hosting the show again today. We're very fortunate to be able to have yet another great virtual program. Normally we might be face-to-face for something like this, but we've had a nice string of spectacular programming. We're going to keep that going today. We are streaming live to Facebook. Recordings will be available after the presentation. For today, while we're live here, it is lunchtime. So I'll remind everybody to keep yourselves muted. If you're eating lunch while we're watching the presentation, maybe just turn off your camera for the sake of everyone else, and we'll keep things going here. I think I had one other, questions. Q&A session after the presentation. Make sure you get those questions in early. We've already got a couple that have been submitted in advance. As we go through the presentation, feel free to start entering them at any time. And we'll do some interaction here after the presentation. If you would like to join live, you've got microphone and video set up on your computer. Just let me know again through the chat, and I'll help coordinate you getting onto the presentation. And then we'll just go ahead and get started here. Without further ado, I will turn the show over to our president of the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading, Dr. Saul Lausch.
Well, good morning, afternoon now, I guess, to everyone. We're very, very pleased and very, very happy to have Ambassador John Herbst as our speaker today. Ambassador Herbst joined the United States Foreign Service in 1979, just in time, as an aside, for the Iran hostage crisis, as he and I noted a bit earlier. He has worked as a political counselor at the US embassies in Tel Aviv, Israel, in Moscow, Russia, and Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. He has had a long and distinguished career of service, and if you read his full biography, when you noted the program on our Constant Contact website, you'll quite agree. He was appointed ambassador to Uzbekistan in 2000 and to the Ukraine in 2003. During the period that became known as the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, Ambassador Herbst was involved in events which led up to and defined Viktor Yushchenko's presidency. During his time as ambassador, he was heavily involved in the events, which led to the furtherance of democracy and openness in the Ukraine as it emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is indeed our privilege and our pleasure to welcome Ambassador Herbst to our forum today as he presents his views on Russia and the Russian and Ukrainian relationship in 2020.
Okay, thank you very much, Saul. It's my pleasure to be here. First thing I have to say is very, very simple, which is that American policy towards Russia and Ukraine is defined by American interests, by things that are good for the United States. And we have an overwhelming interest in a stable and secure Europe. Now that would seem to be a common statement, but it's worth repeating it today because there's an effort by some, including the president, to downplay the importance of our alliance in Europe. The thing to keep in mind is that there has not been a great power war since 1945. World Wars I and II were not just caused the death in the case of World War II of 50 million people. It also destroyed incountable wealth. And World War I was almost as destructive. Since then, since that time, because of our presence in Europe, our NATO alliance, there have been no great power wars. And the last was what? Now we're talking about 65 years, right? No, 75 years from the end of World War II have been unprecedented in world history in terms of peace. Despite all the wars that go on, compared to previous times, this has been an extraordinarily peaceful and safe period for humankind, and an extraordinarily prosperous time. According to statistics, today something like 9–10% of the world lives in deep poverty. In 1945, that number was like 40%. And of course, you go back 200 years, that number was 99%. So we live in an extraordinarily peaceful and prosperous time, despite all the turmoil. And the key to that is the strong American relationship with its allies in Europe and our strong presence in Europe. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this also because our policy towards Russia comes from this perspective. The Cold War ended in late 1990, 1991, when the Soviet Union disappeared. Now, the Cold War period, again, in historical terms, was relatively peaceful because there was no actual hot war between great powers. But it was still a very dangerous time because nuclear Armageddon was over all of our heads. So the Cold War ended, and we set about enhancing our position, not just in Europe, but in the post-Soviet area. And we set about enhancing it by promoting two things: democracy and a market economy. Because we believe those two things are essential for the well-being of people everywhere. And you had something called the third wave of democratization in global history in the 1990s, as virtually all the nations of the Warsaw Pact, which had been under Soviet domination during the Cold War, became democracies. And they joined the European Union, and many of them joined NATO. And if the period since 1945 to today has been very, very prosperous and peaceful, the period since 1990 to today has been even more prosperous and even more peaceful. Our policy towards Russia today is defined by the fact that under President Putin, the Kremlin is pushing back hard against the stable, peaceful, and democratic Europe. Moscow's objectives are very clear. They don't like the fact that the EU has expanded. They don't like the fact that NATO has expanded. And despite commitments that Moscow undertook at the end of the Cold War and in the late periods of the Cold War, they believe that Russia, has the right to determine the future of its near neighbors. They believe they deserve a sphere of influence, which makes it impossible to recognize the actual sovereignty of its neighbors. There's a famous American political scientist, some of you may know his name, John Mearsheimer. I was just in a debate with him regarding NATO a few weeks ago. And Mearsheimer has written, for example, that we should not talk about Ukrainian self-determination. That's too dangerous because Moscow does not accept it. And Moscow, insisting that it has the right to determine its neighbors' policies, have launched 2 wars in Europe in the last 15 years. In 2008, they launched a war against Georgia in the Caucasus. And in 2014, they launched a war against Ukraine. First, they seized Crimea. They then held a sham referendum in which, again, because it was a sham referendum, a large majority said that Crimea should be part of Russia. And then they annexed Crimea. And Moscow also began a war, a sub-Rosa war in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine. And that war continues to this day. The first priority in our policy towards Russia is to get them to cease their aggression in Donbass, to stop the behind closed doors war in eastern Ukraine. The Kremlin claims that the war in Ukraine is actually a civil war. That's nonsense. The 2 areas in Ukraine which Russia occupies, called the Donetsk and the Luhansk People's Republic, have had Russian citizen presidents, defense ministers, intelligence chiefs. Without Russian soldiers, without Russian weapons, without Russian financing, there would be no war in eastern Ukraine. And in the summer of 2014, when a newly elected president in Ukraine was leading a counteroffensive to take back all of eastern Ukraine, Russian troops entered Ukraine and defeated the Ukrainian military forces. So our objective vis-a-vis Moscow is in the very first instance to ensure that it is unable to complete have a success in Ukraine. Moscow's objectives, though, go well beyond Ukraine. Mr. Putin would like to undermine NATO, to undermine the European Union, and to also weaken the main democracies in the West. That's the reason why he interfered in our presidential elections in 2016, in the French presidential elections in 2017. That's the reason why he interfered in the Brexit vote in Great Britain. And that's the reason why he has supported Catalonia against Spanish authorities in Spain. Mr. Putin has not hidden his objectives. He has said regarding the post-Cold War security order established in Europe, an order that he signed up to, his government, not he, but the Russian government signed up to in the early 1990s, that there must be new rules, or as he puts it, new rules or no rules. So our policy is to ensure stability and peace in Europe by making Moscow pay a price for its aggression in Ukraine. And this is the point of departure for our Ukraine policy. Moscow has been unpleasantly surprised by the fact that Ukraine has mounted a staunch defense in its east. And so Moscow is kind of bogged down in eastern Ukraine. For us, it's relatively inexpensive to provide Ukraine with several $100 million of military and domestic aid each year to keep Moscow stuck in eastern Ukraine, to make sure that Moscow does not look beyond Ukraine, to create problems for our NATO allies, especially in the Baltic states. We have no obligation to aid Ukraine, but it is very much in our interests. We do have an obligation to aid Lithuania or Latvia if Moscow were to invade. So our policy, again, towards Russia is defined first by their great aggression in Ukraine to stop it. And our policy to persuade Moscow to stop it is one, to provide assistance to Ukraine, and two, working with our European allies, working with the European Union to put sanctions on Moscow for its aggression in Ukraine. We have put several rounds of sanctions on the Kremlin. The sanctions related to their war in Ukraine, according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, cost Moscow approximately 1 to 1.5% of GDP per year. That's a serious penalty for the Kremlin to pay for its aggression. We provide military assistance to Ukraine, which exploits an important vulnerability in Moscow's position. Putin claims that Russian soldiers are not fighting in Ukraine. The Russian people in numerous polls have said they do not want Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine. But there are Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine. Russian casualties are a major political weakness for Mr. Putin. That's why he hides them. That's why there are penalties for the families of Russian soldiers who die if they speak publicly about where and how their sons died. That's why providing weapons to Ukraine, defensive weapons, is very much in our interest and will, over time, in combination with our sanctions, persuade Moscow to cease its aggression in Ukraine. That is the basic point of departure for our Russia policy. But let me talk about some other elements, because while this is the most important one, it's not the only element. We share some interest with Moscow. We share interest in avoiding a nuclear holocaust. So our policy towards Moscow includes a willingness to engage on arms control agreements. And I completely endorse that. We also share with the Kremlin interest in stopping narcotics trafficking, which is a problem throughout Europe. problem in the United States. We share an interest in stopping terrorism, although, of course, Moscow is sponsoring terrorism in Georgia and in Ukraine. But they don't have an interest in terrorism, in Islamic terrorism, for example, gaining a foothold in Central Asia, or for that matter, in the Asian part of Russia. So we have interest there. And there's no reason why we should not promote dialogue with Moscow to talk about these problems. But the most important thing, again, is to stop Kremlin aggression, to stop Kremlin revisionism. And that leads us to our Ukraine policy. I've already talked about that a little bit, talked about our support for Ukraine as it fights Kremlin aggression. The Atlantic Council, where I work, were among the leaders calling for arms to Ukraine back in 2015. The Obama administration was not that interested in that, but that's one good thing that Trump did in our relationship with Ukraine. He agreed to send Javelin missiles, which destroy tanks, to Ukraine in December of 2017. But a strong Ukraine will not become strong only by fighting Kremlin aggression. Ukraine has serious systemic economic and political problems, which you might say are the legacy of the Soviet period. Ukraine is, I would call it a budding democracy. You've had fair presidential elections now for the past 16 years. That's a significant achievement in that part of the world. But it remains economically a deeply corrupt state. And this is a serious problem for not just the well-being of Ukraine, but its ability to withstand Kremlin aggression. So we have a major program promoting reform in Ukraine and promoting assistance to Ukraine conditioned on reform, not simply giving them handouts, but giving them major assistance, hundreds of millions of dollars of assistance, as long as they undertake reform. And the record since the Maidan Revolution of 2014, I would say, is solid, but not great. There have been some major changes in the Ukrainian economy, positive changes. They have largely cleaned up the natural gas sector, which was far and away the most lucrative and the most corrupt sector in Ukraine's economy. But they have left many things undone. And the new president, well, he's not so new now, Mr. Zelensky has been in office for about 14 months, came in arguing strongly to go after corruption, and his record, which was strong the first year, is now growing weaker by the day. Okay, those are the basics of our policy towards Russia and Ukraine. But let me mention one more thing, which you probably know more about than anything I've discussed thus far. And that is the peculiar events in American policy towards Ukraine last year, which led to the impeachment of President Trump, the impeachment trial of President Trump. Let me say something first about myself, so you are aware. The Atlantic Council and I personally have been criticized because from 2017 to 2019, we received funding for our work. We received funding from many places, and one of our funders in that 3-year period was a company whose name you may know, Burisma. That's the company for which Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, worked. And I'm telling you that because this is something you should be aware of, as I described to you the US-Ukraine relationship and the impeachment hearings last fall. My belief is that President Trump did decide to withhold military and economic assistance from Ukraine in order to persuade Ukraine to investigate Vice President Biden's activity and his son's activity as possibly corrupt actors in Ukraine. And I'm very familiar with our policy towards Ukraine. I've been working on this for the last 6 years. You can justly criticize Hunter Biden for taking a job with Burisma, which paid him very nicely. You can criticize him for that. It does not speak well about our political system or the Ukrainian political system that he was offered that job. but that was not illegal. And the family and relatives of politicians in both of our political parties do this all over the world. So you can criticize them for that, but it's, again, not illegal, and everyone does it. Joe Biden, as a lead person in our policy towards Ukraine, insisted on removing the Ukrainian Attorney General, a man named Shokin. And our policy, and Joe Biden wanted him removed because, among other things, that Attorney General, was not investigating Burisma, which had a dubious reputation. I believe that President Trump, and I think the evidence demonstrates this, was withholding assistance for a couple of months from Ukraine to persuade the president of Ukraine to investigate Biden. And the president of Ukraine correctly did not do that. When this became public, President Trump released the hold on the assistance, and the assistance went. I regret that the Democrats then tried to impeach Trump over that. I think he should have been criticized for it, but I think impeachment was unnecessary. But that made the issue of Ukraine a very hot one in American politics, which was not good for our policy and not good for our national interests. I believe that the whole question of Biden's activities in Ukraine when he was vice president will become at least a small news story, because Biden, of course, is running for the presidency. But I don't think it will become a major news story, because the so-called evidence supporting this all comes from people of very dubious background who have no credibility. And this is pretty well understood today. Okay, that's what I had to say by way of introduction. I'm happy to take any questions on any of the things I've raised or anything else relating to our foreign policy.
Absolutely. Great start. Good context here. We do have a couple questions coming in, so I think I'll just jump right into that. Just to follow up on what you just said about the relationship with Ukraine, and I had read your statement from May expressing concern over that. So withholding the money had material impact on their ability to defend themselves. Did we see any other impact in terms of, like, was it perceived as a signal to Russia that they could be more bold in their encroachment, or like were there other impact besides just that delay in the actual funding?
Ultimately, the damage was not that great because the delay was about 2 months, and it was only publicly known for about a week, because once it was known again, the decision was reversed. Certainly, Moscow welcomed this when they saw it, but it was over so quickly, I don't think they were able to take advantage of it. But there was one other impact, which is unfortunate and perhaps the most long-lasting. We have a habit, we the United States have a habit of offering advice to people all around the world. And often that advice is very good. And certainly when we've been telling Ukraine for the last 30 years to reform, that has been good advice. But as you might guess, people don't necessarily like hearing the advice, especially when the advice we're offering is politically difficult to do. So Zelensky and his team, when they were being muscled by President Trump, were saying to themselves, how in the world can the United States tell us what to do on reform when this is the behavior of the United States? And that understanding is still there in Ukraine, still there in between the ears of the president of Ukraine. And that's unfortunate. That to me is the major damage of that episode.
Yeah, and lots of questions I think about Ukraine. I'll just kind of slip in some other questions from the members. David Carroll, who's a longtime board member, past president of the World Affairs Council, on a topic other than Ukraine, asks, what do you think the partial U.S. troop withdrawal from Germany in terms of NATO?
I think that's a serious mistake. It may be, there could be a reason for withdrawing some troops from Germany. I say could be. Therefore, I'm not saying withdrawal is necessarily a problem, a partial withdrawal, a small withdrawal. The problem is the way it was handled. This was announced as a unilateral decision by the United States. That's not the way you treat allies, especially a very important ally like Germany. NATO has worked to our advantage for reasons I did not mention explicitly, but it was implicit in what I said at the top. There has been no major war in Europe after Europe produced 2 world wars in the last century. NATO is the principal reason for that. And the United States has established a very strong, positive tradition of working closely with allies, seeking their agreements, seeking their cooperation, providing leadership, but not demanding that they do X or Y or Z, or insulting them unnecessarily. So it may make sense to move a small fraction of troops out of Germany, especially if we're moving them eastward to Poland or to Romania or to the Baltic states, but to not talk to the Germans about this privately and reach some sort of understanding, big, big mistake.
So you've touched on a couple different areas where there's been impact: the interference in the Brexit election, interference in the French election. Obviously, we had the case of the bounties being paid in Afghanistan. So we see Ukraine and Afghanistan as kind of major, maybe anchor points to the U.S. relationship with Russia. Are there other countries that we really should be paying attention to that are driving this?
I'm sorry, that are driving.
So the relationship between the U.S. and Russia is there's a lot going on in Ukraine that's affecting that. There's a lot going on in Afghanistan that's affecting that. What other kind of hotspots or areas of focus are we seeing?
You've covered most of them, but we find that Moscow has not played a helpful role with North Korea. We find that Moscow intervened in the Syria war in ways to prop up Assad. We've seen Moscow intervene in Libya. None of these things are positive from our point of view. They are not as important as Moscow's aggression in Ukraine, but they are a reminder that Putin sees a principal objective in simply making trouble for the United States.
Okay. And so I guess that's one of my questions, is about the motivation, making trouble for the United States, right? We had the interference in our election. Then you mentioned Brexit in France. What is driving it? Do they have specific outcomes in mind? It almost seems like it could just be driven to drive chaos. Like, do we know anything about the motivations behind that?
Well, in Europe, it's clear they see this as a zero-sum game. So if the EU is strong, they lose. If NATO is strong, they lose. So they try to drive wedges among the countries in those two organizations. In Syria, they've had a long relationship with the Assad regime, and they see bolstering that regime as in their interest. And point of fact, I am less critical of their role in Syria than I am of their role in other places. In North Korea, I think that they believe a true nuclear deal leading to our improved relations with Pyongyang is not in their interest. So they are not helpful. Unfortunately, again, they tend to define their policy as one of opposition to ours almost across the board. Now, I don't want to overstate the danger that they represent. I mean, Moscow is our peer equivalent with nuclear weapons, so that's important. But their economy is essentially a third world economy, and they can't retain great power status unless they can somehow revitalize their economy, and Putin is not doing anything to achieve that. But they are a declining power, but nonetheless a very dangerous one.
Mm-hmm. And that's related to Bruce May's question. Is Russia the greatest external threat to our country at this time?
No, the greatest threat is China, because China has a real economy. And with a real economy, they can maintain a real military, and the military is becoming stronger in ways that the Russian military is not. But Moscow is clearly the number 2 threat. And Moscow's behavior has, at this point, been more provocative than China's. I'm not saying China's behavior has not been provocative. Certainly building those artificial islands in the South China Sea, what they've been doing in Hong Kong, what they're doing with their own Uyghur population, nasty stuff. But they have not invaded another country.
I think, and China's an interesting, that was going to be one of my next questions, because we've had a couple presentations recently. We had Chris Miller talking about Russia. We've had presentations on China, and it seems like, again, different motivations. So you mentioned China's economic motivation. We talked a little bit about Russia's kind of power-driven motivation. I know sanctions is one of your areas of specialty. Sanctions come into play both. How do we see the effectiveness and impact and approach of sanctions towards those countries differently and in effectiveness?
Well, we have a much greater ability with sanctions to inflict pain on the Kremlin for bad policies because their economy is so weak. And they don't have anywhere near the ability to strike back to our sanctions. So this is a major, major asymmetric advantage for us vis-a-vis Moscow. With China, it's much more complicated because they do have a real economy. And we all know that China's been buying, US Treasury notes in great number. We know that we have major business interests in China. And while I give the Trump administration a lot of credit for pushing back hard against unequal trade deals with China, or for going after China for its industrial theft, for taking our intellectual property, we can't simply sanction China the way we can Russia. But we have taken, I think, some sound steps in the past year or two under the Trump administration to reduce our vulnerabilities vis-a-vis China.
All right, a lot of questions coming in about Ukraine. I'll try and group those a latter. One more before I come back to Ukraine fully. Dave Carroll again asks about your comment on the rise of authoritarian rule generally and in Poland and Hungary in particular.
Well, we've seen that this is now a trend. I mentioned in my opening remarks the third wave of democratization in the 1990s. We're now in a period of reaction to that democratization. And if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have described Poland and Hungary as great successes without qualification. Now I think I have to say that they are successes, but with some real questions, some real doubts. I say more so in the case of Hungary than Poland, but in Poland too. Democracy is not easy. Democracy requires, among other things, tolerance. And so there's always going to be, especially in countries without a strong democratic tradition, an authoritarian temptation. That temptation, to my mind, has gone too far in Hungary, but it is not, I would not call Hungary an authoritarian state just yet. In Poland, the process is not quite as so far advanced, but still it's gone pretty far. I think we just need to work hard on this to prevent further advances in either country or a spillover effect into neighboring countries. Mm. And by the way, excuse me, Moscow is a supporter of these authoritarian tendencies because they understand that, of course, the EU, but also NATO are essentially democracy clubs.
So the support goes back to the idea that anything they can do to weaken their opponents and the alliances of their opponents is beneficial to them?
Yes.
And I mean, I feel like I'll probably ask a couple times about the motivations, but what's the end goal? Jeanette Winkler in chat asks, does Putin really want to make Russia great again? We talked about, what are they protecting? They want self-determination, but is it about power? Is it about rebuilding the economy? What are they trying to get to?
I think that there are two important drivers of Kremlin policy. One is they want to be seen and to have the influence of a great power. or one of the great powers, not one of five or six, but I think they want to be seen with the US and China as a major global power. And they define their power overwhelmingly in political military terms. It is true that as a result of the Cold War, Moscow lost control over a substantial amount of territory. All of the Warsaw Pact states were no longer under the Kremlin thumb, and the other republics of the former Soviet Union, and of which Ukraine in terms of population is the largest, but we're talking about the 5 Central Asian countries, we're talking about the 3 countries in the Caucasus, and then Moldova and Belarus, along with Ukraine in the west of the former Soviet Union. They lost sovereignty. Moscow lost direct political control over them and is trying to make sure it has some form of hegemony over them. And that's why they went to war in Georgia, and that's why they're currently at war in Ukraine. So from the standpoint of a Russian imperialist, Putin's right. The worst thing that happened in the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. But in terms of the peoples of all these countries, including Russia, that was a very positive step. The Soviet Union was this egregious, oppressive state. So what Russia wants is this great power role, which gives them the opportunity, gives them the right and the power to determine the policy of all of its new neighbors. But the second thing that the Putin regime wants, is he and his cronies have become very wealthy. Very wealthy. Russia, like Ukraine, suffers from extraordinary corruption. But in the case of Russia, the corruption really starts at the top, because given the political power that Mr. Putin exercises. And they want to ensure that their style of regime remains in place, which enables them to enjoy the benefits of this corruption. And of course, the benefits of power. Those are his two objectives. And that's that's one reason why people think that Putin has intervened in Ukraine. He didn't like the idea of people on the streets of Kiev getting rid of an elected leader, an authoritarian leader.
It's helpful to understand that they define power in terms of political influence and military strength. I think to me that helps make sense of some of what we see. In terms of cultivating political power, the PR and cyber attacks on elections, for example, can be very inexpensive and effective. But going to war is very expensive, right? So what you had said earlier, they have a very weak economy. He has a strong interest in personal enrichment. What allows them to fund and continue the wars without that stronger economic backing?
Well, the wars they're conducting are not that expensive. We don't. I'm no longer in the U.S. government, so I don't have access to classified information. But my understanding is there are a minimum of a couple of thousand Russian troops in Donbass. It could be as many as 10 or 11. They're providing, the war may cost them several $billions a year. They can afford that. Of course, the sanctions cost them a lot more than that. But if they choose to, they can afford that as well. Over time, they may decide it's too expensive. But at this point, Mr. Putin does not think that way.
Yeah, I guess they get that double benefit of if they keep it going in the Ukraine and they can interfere in Afghanistan, there's that added political benefit of just making trouble for us, right? The US.
Well, yeah, except I mean, what I'm about to say is not universally accepted. I think that the war in Ukraine is a bigger problem, much bigger problem for Putin than for us. Because again, to lose 1% of your GNP is not a good thing over time. It means your economy becomes weaker, your country becomes weaker. But again, he can sustain this. It's sustainable, but I suspect it's not sustainable forever. People like to say that Putin is popular in Russia, even despite his declining ratings, and that Russia is therefore as a stable authoritarian state. But the thing to keep in mind about authoritarian states is that they're stable until suddenly they're not. And we're witnessing today major demonstrations in Khabarovsk in the Russian Far East. I'm not predicting the downfall of Mr. Putin, but it's not inconceivable to see that his regime is in trouble in a few years, or if not a few years, certainly 15. But for the short term, we assume that they'll continue. I'm pretty much along the same path.
Okay, so we're moving back in the direction of the Ukraine. Larry Cohen asks, what has been the impact on our influence and soft power vis-a-vis Ukraine and the region by slashing of the Voice of America and Free Radio Europe and other public diplomacy entities?
I don't know if he's talking about slashing budgets or if he's talking about the changes that were just brought by new leadership at RFE and RL.
So I'll give you a moment to clarify that, Larry. If you want to maybe even jump in, you can let me know. And we will jump to Kevin. Okay, so questions from Saul. You were the ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006. What has changed the most since then?
Well, the Maidan revolution led to another round of reform right away in 2014. Again, I mentioned earlier that they cleaned up the natural gas sector, which was a huge achievement. You then had, at the beginning of President Poroshenko's rule, and he was first elected in 2014. He was elected in 2014, not first. There was a round of reform, but then he ceased to be a reformer. That led to a new president, Zelensky, who was elected last year. He had a very frenetic 8 or so months of reform, but now that is also bogged down. But these are still positive steps going forward. And of course, perhaps the most important change has been the war, which began in February of 2014, and which still plagues Ukraine.
All right. So to clarify Larry's question about the slashing of the VOA and RFE, he says he's referring to leadership, but then also the budgetary and loss of personnel impact, and they're very experienced and skilled language interpreters.
To be honest, I don't have enough to answer this question precisely. It is true that often when you have new leadership, they'll make some changes. It does seem that these changes are a bit more, a good bit larger than the norm. I don't know if it's had a negative impact on our broadcasting out in the field. I can't say I have good information that it has had that impact. That's basically all I can say.
Okay, so I'll ask again about kind of this corruption. Ukraine struggling to align itself with the West democratically. What factors in recent history give hope that it will succeed? And maybe I'll even then bring up there was an article on your site about the July 23rd attack where the house of Vitaly Shubidin was burned down, which is seen as a kind of a hit or attack on the reform movement. So do we see things moving in the right direction? Is there hope? What gives us hope in the future? Or is this a major hit? Like what's going to be the impact of that?
Certainly the attack on Shabunin, who's a major anti-corruption activist, was a blow to reform in Ukraine. There has been major pushback against Ukrainian reformers over the past 12 months. We did an event yesterday with Shabunin and with Valeria Guntarova, who was the head of the National Bank of Ukraine until early in 2019. Her house was also burned down. And she had done great work cleaning up Ukraine's corrupt banking sector. And some of Ukraine's most notorious oligarchs considered her an enemy. And some of those same oligarchs consider Shabunin an enemy. The only good thing I could say about this is a year ago, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, refused to comment on the burning down of Guntarova's house. He did comment within 24 hours after Shabunin's house was burnt down. He said the right thing. It's outrageous that people, they need to find the perpetrators and so on. But this speaks to arguably the principal problem in Ukraine, even more important than Moscow's aggression, because I think Ukraine will win that fight with our help, with the help of the EU and with our NATO allies. It's the fight against corruption. There has been progress. I mentioned progress in 2014, progress in 2019, but there's been really no progress in the court system of Ukraine, very little progress in the prosecutorial function in Ukraine. In other words, great corruption in both the courts and in the attorneys general in Ukraine. And this is where a great deal more work is needed.
So culturally, Russia's more aligned with Europe than with Asia, and the arc of history for most of Europe is clearly democratic. What is it in the cultural fabric of Russia that seems to always bend autocratic?
Well, I think it's simply that there is a now, depending upon where you date Russian history back to, there's an 800 or 900 year pedigree of authoritarianism, or a 400 or 500 year. If you go back to Kiev and Rus, you're talking about the 10th century. You go back to Muscovy, you're talking about the 14th or 15th century. But Moscow has almost always, not always, but almost always been under the hand of an autocrat. First the Tsars and then the Soviets. Putin and his team like to say that they have a managed democracy, but the emphasis really on the managed and not so much on the democracy. No one who is involved in international monitoring of elections in a sound way gives the Russians credit over the past few presidential elections for honest and fair elections. Just hasn't happened. But this has just been the pattern of political life as developed in Russia. It doesn't mean that they are doomed to this forever. There have been periods in Russian history where it was democracy. I do a lot of work with Russian reformers who are firm Democrats. I think at some point Moscow will move in that direction, but I'm just not sure when.
And thanks to Saul for helping put together some of these questions. If we stick to kind of this historical balance, Crimea has a long history of being controlled by others. Following World War II, it was under Soviet control, then became part of Ukraine. Now the Russians want it back. What can we expect there? What's the impact of that in the area?
Well, Crimea is a very important subject. The Moscow says that this is no longer a subject for conversation, that they annexed it, it's theirs. But of course, almost no one internationally recognizes Kremlin control of Crimea. Our policy has been very sensible. We've adapted the policy on the Baltic states during Soviet times and are applying it to Crimea. Secretary of State Pompeo issued a statement 2 years ago, which said that we do not recognize Russian control of Crimea. We will never recognize this is Ukrainian territory. It should be returned to Ukraine, and businesses who do dealings in Crimea are subject to sanctions. We're not promising to go to war about Crimea. We're promising to do just what we did with the Baltic states when the Soviets incorporated them in 1940.
We're winding down, I think, on the questions about Ukraine. So there's still time to get a couple more of those in. Kevin Calabria had asked, how do you feel about Russia selling natural gas to Germany? And just also said, thank you for the talk.
Germany needs to get natural gas from somewhere. So for them to get it from Russia is fine. But there is a question about the Nord Stream 2 project. Traditionally, Moscow sent its oil and gas to Western Europe and to Germany through big pipelines run through Ukraine in the south and Belarus and Poland in the north. They built the Nord Stream 1 pipeline to go into the Baltic Sea 10 or so years ago. And they've been trying for the last 7 or so years to build a Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I am a strong opponent of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I believe that its objective is not economic, it's geopolitical. It's designed to give Moscow the ability to cut off gas flows to countries in between Germany and Moscow that Moscow wants to punish. Ukraine is one of those countries, Belarus is another, Poland is the third. And there have been several times when Moscow, for political reasons, has shut off the flow of gas. So I welcome the sanctions that the Trump administration placed on Nord Stream 2 earlier this year, last month, in fact. I welcome the sanctions that Congress put on Nord Stream 2 late last year. These are all positive developments.
And that's related to that $2 trillion Exxon deal that they were trying to get done for a while, right?
I don't know is the short answer. I don't think so.
Oh, okay, I might be conflating that with something else. All right. Okay, so any more questions about Ukraine? Get those in. We'd still have some time left here. I wanted to touch on in your past early 2000s, you acted as a coordinator of reconstruction and stabilization, as I understand from your biography. And that involved working with nations transitioning from strife and civil unrest. And that phrase, strife and civil unrest, hit a little close to home. So I guess I want to ask, like, is there anything from that experience that you see, civil unrest on the racial and judicial issues at home, obviously struggling with the impact of this virus economically, socially, politically. Is there a parallel? Like, is that comparable to maybe some of your experience in the past? And what do we have to look forward to here?
I think it is largely not comparable, largely, but not entirely. I'm old enough to have experienced, I was in high school, the civil unrest in the United States in the late 60s. Some of that was racially motivated. Some of that was just politically motivated without a major racial element. And at the time, it looked like the country was unraveling. But those protests and the riots we saw in American cities suddenly ceased. And the country resumed, you might say, its more normal progression. I suspect that's what's happening now, too. Although I say I suspect, I'm not certain of that. We're still in a period of turmoil. There seems to be a recognition that we need to do a better job on certain race-related issues, and especially relations between police and minority communities. I believe there are good faith efforts to address that. And I suspect that once we get past our presidential election, things here will calm down. But there are no guarantees.
Yeah, I guess what made me more curious about that was that combination with the economic impact of the COVID-19 virus and the challenges that was going to create, and the kind of combination of the two.
That's an important observation. Certainly, COVID has dealt our economy a huge blow. I think most Americans understand that, meaning they understand that this was like a once in a century event, which has hurt our economy in a major fashion. And I'm not certain that by itself has led to unrest. It may fuel it a little bit, but I think the American people are again smart and sober enough to see this for what it is, meaning the COVID impact. The racial matters, of course, are long-standing, going back centuries, and we're still paying a penalty for what some folks refer to as the original sin in the American experiment. Certainly, there's been great progress, but certainly there are major inequities that remain as a result of slavery.
Absolutely. And we're winding down on the questions. So there's, I guess we'll say this is the last call for questions from members. What's on your radar right now internationally? Like what are we expecting? What do you have your eye on?
Well, my day job is to follow Eurasia, right? So that means, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and so on. And on my day job, the things I'm watching are first, Nord Stream 2. Again, we're encouraged by the Trump administration sanctions. We expect further sanctions from Congress, and we think there's a good chance that that project is going to die. Although most people talk about it as a done deal. So that's one. Two, there's going to be a presidential election in Belarus on Sunday. Uncharacteristically, for like 6 or more weeks, there have been tens of thousands of demonstrators in the capital of Belarus, in Minsk, demonstrating against the president of the country because he is an authoritarian. The president of Belarus, Lukashenko, has arrested one of his presidential opponents, and he's banned the other from the vote. So he's clearly worried. There are reports that Russian mercenaries are in Minsk, and possibly to make sure that things don't get out of hand. So this is something we're watching closely. In fact, we're doing an event on it. If anyone in the audience wants to tune in next Tuesday. We're also watching closely what's happening in the Russian Far East city of Khabarovsk, where there have also been demonstrations in support of their removed governor, their arrested governor. This has also been happening for many weeks. And Khabarovsk is a city with about 500,000 or maybe 600,000 residents. They've pulled over 100,000 demonstrators, which is an extraordinary number. And the fact it's been going on for weeks and weeks and weeks is interesting. What that means, I hesitate to say, but I could see this creating a scenario where things begin to unravel. I pay a lot of attention to the Russia-Chinese relationship. They are acting as informal allies. That is not in our interest. And I believe this is happening because Moscow does not recognize how dangerous China is. Certain things have happened lately suggesting that that relationship is becoming more complicated. And I hope to write about that later this week. But that bears watching. And of course, outside of Eurasia, the rise of China, the challenge it represents the United States, should concern all Americans.
So you prefaced that with saying this is what you're paying attention to at your day job. What's got your attention personally?
Right, but again, China would fall into, it's part of my day job, but part not.
Okay.
And I mean, I've been saying for 5 years that the most immediate danger to the United States is Russia, but the long-term danger is China. So that's very, very important. I believe that the other major challenges we have internationally, North Korea and Iran, are not nearly as important as China. Their ability to do harm is significantly smaller than China's ability. So we have to keep that in mind. I believe our weak policy towards China has been changing over the last several years. The Trump administration deserves a lot of credit for that, but Congress has been amenable to this message, both Democrats and Republicans in Congress. But we need to do more work in this area.
All right. Well, it has been a pleasure speaking with you today, Ambassador. I'll wrap up with hopefully one fun question, and that is you've been at this for a while. What is your favorite fact or your most interesting bit of trivia that you think none of us on the call probably know?
Gee, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. Let me answer this indirectly. I wouldn't call it trivia. It's real, and it was not unimportant at the time. from my days as an ambassador in Ukraine. I was there during the Orange Revolution. And for those who are not following the Orange Revolution, which occurred nearly 16 years ago, people in Ukraine poured out into the streets of Kiev and other cities, hundreds of thousands of people, to protest a fraudulent presidential election. And my job was, at that time as ambassador, was to make sure that there was no crackdown, violent crackdown on those demonstrators. And after about a week of demonstrations, a decision was taken for a crackdown. And they were going to bring in special police, not from the capital of Kiev, but from elsewhere in the country, to clear out the streets and use whatever force necessary to make that happen. And I was given a warning this would happen by someone in the opposition, the party that had won the presidential elections, but had not been acknowledged as the winners. And I tried to call the president of Ukraine to arrange a phone call between Vice Secretary of State Powell and the president of Ukraine to say, so that Powell could tell him no crackdown. I was told that the president was sleeping. This was late at night. This was like at midnight. In fact, even 12:30 in the morning in Ukraine. So 5:30 in the morning in Washington, 6:30 in Washington. And I was told that the president of Ukraine was sleeping. And I simply left a message. Well, he should understand that no one believes he's sleeping. And if there's a crackdown, major consequences will follow. And about a half an hour after I delivered that message, I received word from the opposition camp that the crackdown, the police had stood down. They went, as he put it, they went back into their barracks. So I went to bed that night thinking that the United States had stopped a major crackdown in Ukraine. But I learned the next morning that at the same time I was on the phone with the president's assistant, the chief of the army was on the phone with the head of the police. The chief of the army was meeting at that time with the second most important opposition figure, Yulia Tymoshenko. And the chief of the army told the chief of police that if the chief of police's forces went out on the streets, the army would be there to stop them. So I was wrong when I thought that we had stopped that violence. But I thought your audience might appreciate that story.
Yeah, is we take the outcome either way, right? Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for the time you spent with us this afternoon. Everybody on the call, I'm sure, appreciates it. I hope we get the chance to talk again, and I will turn the meeting over to Saul.
Yes, I'd like to also say, as Mike has said, and I know we all agree, thank you very much for the message you've delivered to us today. For many of us here, your early reminders about the Cold War and the 1950s, when some of us were growing up in those days, was very, very refreshing and very helpful. It was a very trying time. And I know personally, for example, I'm a great admirer of Dwight Eisenhower. And I think he was a great man during that time and led us in a very, so thank you for that preliminary set of remarks from me personally.
All right. Thank you. I enjoyed this very much. I hope I didn't bore you.
We have to get your address, incidentally. We have a small gift for you, and I'm going to send that to you, but maybe we can do that. If you'll just send it to us in some way, that would be great.
Okay.
So
shoot me an email and I'll respond.
Okay. Coming up, you may be interested in this, but we have coming up as well. We're very pleased. We have on August 19, Nicholas Millwood, who is at 10 o'clock a.m., not our usual noontime. He's reporting from Japan, presenting from Japan on China's expansion and the steppe people of Central Asia. Mr. Millwood is, I think he's a native of Berks County, but he's on active duty with US Marine Corps, stationed presently in Japan. But he will be presenting to us in his private capacity and as president of the Yokosuka Council on Asia Pacific Studies. Interesting topic that we don't regularly address.
It's a very important topic, and there have been developments in the past few weeks of import regarding that. So this is he's working professionally how?
He's in the Marines. I understand he may be retiring. He's still a young man, but he's presenting to us in his capacity as president of this of the Yokosuka Council in Japan. So that's one presentation we have coming up. September 10th, then we have Milan Vyashnov, a senior fellow and director of the South Asian program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He will present to us on India in the COVID-19 era. And his topic is, Can Modi turn the tide? Excuse me. And October 14 at noon, at noon, Jessica Brandt, who is rescheduled with us from the spring, head of research and policy at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and a fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She is going to present to us on the foreign interference in democracies, what to watch for the rest of this year, and certainly into, I'm sure, 2021.
Terrific.
So we're very pleased to make that known. Folks who regularly follow us, keep in contact with our website for better detail. Also, most of you, I think, receive the Constant Contact newsletter, and we're telling you about it here now. So we hope you can plan for those. We think they'll be very interesting for you.
My pleasure.
And thank you again, Ambassador Herbst.
And good stuff coming up.
Mike?
All right. Thanks, everyone.